Well, good morning. We're continuing our theme, Empowered Choices, with today's topic, between stimulus and response. This is one of my favorite concepts, and it is part of the field minister's materials, so I'm sort of following them. The full quote is, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. This quote has been attributed to both Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl and motivator Stephen Covey, author of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Actually, Stephen Covey found the quote in a book, but did not save the title or the author. Later, when he found the work of Viktor Frankl, he saw the similarities to the quote. Stephen Covey, in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, writes, Frankl himself suffered torture and innumerable indignities, never knowing from one moment to the next if his path would lead to the ovens or if it would be among the saved, who would remove the bodies or shovel out the ashes of those so fated. One day, naked and alone in a small room, he began to become aware of what he later called the last of the human freedoms. The freedom his Nazi captors could not take away. They could control his entire environment. They could do what they wanted to his body. But Viktor Frankl himself was a self-aware being who could look as an observer at his very involvement. His basic identity was intact. He could decide within himself how all of this was going to affect him. Between what happened to him and his response to it was his freedom or power to choose that response. This space or gap between an encounter and our response to it is the place of our greatest power, a place where we can make a conscious choice that reflects the highest and best that is in us. And the wider that gap, the more conscious the choice. In fact, the Buddhists refer to this gap as the sacred pause. We've all fallen prey to knee-jerk responses. Someone says something unkind and we respond in a like manner. Someone cuts us off on the highway and we respond with a graphic hand gesture. I did that once when I was a minister in Florida and then thought, oh my goodness, what if that had become someone from the church? When our response is impetuous, impulsive, and mechanical, we're responding from our reptilian brain, that part of a cerebral cortex that dates back to pre-verbal times and was necessary when we, as cavemen, needed a hair trigger response so that we could eat and not be eaten. It still has a necessary place, and it is the part of our brain that controls the routing function of our body, but it may not serve as the best place to react from when we're faced with present-day experiences and situations. If we deliberately make the space between stimulus and response larger by a couple of seconds, or even overnight or a day or two, we have some time to absorb the situation, giving ourselves so much more room to both how and when we want to react. There are many ways to create a gap. When I was a little girl, my mother told me, before I responded in anger, to take a deep breath and count to 10. We might use a mantra, peace, infinite peace is mine now. Say it to ourselves a few times before we react. If it's possible, we might remove ourselves from the situation completely. My grandparents were both 15 years old when they were married, and I've never known two people who loved each other more. My grandfather was very laid back, and my grandmother, with an Irish heritage, was very feisty. When they started to argue, my grandfather would say, I think I'm going to take a walk. And he would leave for several minutes. When he came back, if my grandmother was still ranting, he would say, I don't think I'm finished with my walk. And out the door he'd go for another 10 minutes. Even though my grandmother wasn't happy about Grandpa's leaving, It did give her time to calm down and decide if the argument really was worth having. On a website called Thinker's Playground, author Gavin Maurice gives us some good reasons for creating that gap. The most obvious, we have more time to choose a better response. We've given our choice to respond over to a higher part of our brain, not the part that knows only fight or flight. This higher brain has the ability to be empathetic, to come from love even when we hurt, to bring forth the tenderness that is part of who we are. We'll be more in control and will seem that way to others. Usually, when we're asked a question, especially in a stressful situation, we want to respond as quickly as possible. But taking a short pause for a second or two can not only be a great way to buy more thinking time, it also makes us seem more collected and in control to those we are talking to. Additionally, our answers or responses will be more thought out since we've taken the time to mull over what we said. Yeah? We become more mindful of our reactions. Mr. Morris says, by applying some mindfulness techniques and reflecting on your reactions, you can also learn a great deal about their origins. There's always a reason that you react the way you do, right? Whether it's fear of losing control, a past betrayal, critical parents, an abusive spouse, or just having to put up with a situation we really didn't like. We all carry around learned responses to certain types of triggers. By taking a moment to be mindful of how we're reacting in a given situation, we can start to dissect why we're reacting that way. From this more objective and distance viewpoint, we can start to decide on better ways to react in future. We can discover another, better response. Sometimes the best response is no response. The best reaction is no reaction. We have time in the gap to look at how we're about to respond so that we do not contribute to more stress or hurt, like the last word in an argument, the hurtful name thrown in to add injury, unnecessarily digging up the past. And again, since we're responding from our higher self, if we do react, it will be from a place of love and from compassion. And the fifth, we act less out of habit. When we take those pauses that allow our choice to come from our higher selves, we can begin to see just how much of our behavior is habitual. And once we're aware of our habits, we can make new and more conscious choices to create new and better ones. We might also consider our mental habits. 2 psychologists out of Princeton concluded that it only takes 1/10 of a second to form a first impression. Think about that, 1/10 of a second. Our first impressions are based on our inner habitual responses. How often is our criticism of others an indication that it is we who need to shift our perception and we who need to clean the windows of our judgment? What we see while watching others depends on the purity of the window through which we look. Many years ago, John Neendorf was the editor of the Science of Mind magazine, and he wrote an article called The Windshield Theater. He wrote, "Watching anonymous people is a fascinating pastime. There are, of course, an endless number of opportunities to do it, though one of the most accessible is while waiting for an automobile at a pedestrian crosswalk. There, for 15 or 20 seconds, we may freely observe those people who cross the street in front of us. Unlike most other situations where strangers encounter each other in public, this one permits us to stare quite openly without giving offense." Generally, pedestrians aren't even aware of the nearby drivers, and they do not care if they're being studied. In this 15-second theater of life, We observers have no basis for forming any meaningful evaluations of these passersby, but how frequently it happens that we form speculative opinions in response to some detail or characteristic that we've noticed. That seedy man must be on welfare and probably wouldn't take a job if you offered him one. There's a fellow with a scar on his face. I wonder if he gets used to people staring at him. Oh, wow, that's the ugliest person I ever saw. I'll bet he has no friends. That teen looks so angry. I'll bet he pushes drugs. I continued these reactions, not placing much importance upon them, considering that they are just mental bubbles, appearing, floating, popping, disappearing, forgotten. But there came a day when I realized that my characterizations of these anonymous people had absolutely nothing to do with them. Rather, I was witnessing the raw material of life and seeing what I chose to see. Not only were many of my visions critical and uncharitable, but because these people were utterly unknown to me, I knew that I was not evaluating them. I was evaluating myself, and that was not a comfortable awareness. Thus, it was that I first decided to exercise a deliberate and conscious control over something even so fleeting as a random mental impression, which might last no more than a fraction of a second. And I invented a new game. The next time I saw a shabbily dressed man with his toes tunneling through the sides of his shoes, I thought, I will no longer decide automatically that you are a bum. I say that you've just arrived in town and that you're broke and friendless, but you're also determined to make the best of your life from now on, and you must get a temporary job, and you're very pleased with life. I could almost imagine that the man's posture became a little more erect as he vanished from my sight. The man with the scar on his face, let's make him a fireman who entered a flaming house, breaking through a glass panel to save the life of a child. He's so dear to all that know him, and he was always surrounded by friends, laughter, and love. And the man I deemed ugly, I see his beautiful blue eyes and study his long fingers and decide that he is a concert pianist, inspiring students with his passion and talent and with his interest in them. The teenager, he isn't angry at all. He's lost in thought as he contemplates the responsibility that comes with the scholarship that he's just won to the university of his dreams. That's a harmless game, the object of which is to create instant, virtuous mini-biographies that erase negative impressions and replace them with positive ones. And if we invent stories which are slightly outrageous or melodramatic, no damage is done. We're not trying to transmit our fictions, nor are we attempting to bring about changes in those people. The focus of the game is always ourselves. It trains us mentally to anticipate goodness and virtue. It has the overall effect of raising our own consciousness as our world of the windshield theater becomes peopled with wonderful characters who have done wonderful things. The Apostle Paul wrote, "Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things." What happens when we play the windshield game is that we're creating a new thought habit so that our mind is filled with ideas that are pure, lovely, and of good report. And when we create that pause between stimulus and response, we already have a compassionate mindset from which we choose our reactions. By slipping into the gap, we move from an outer, material, ego-centered consciousness into a consciousness without bonds, without separation, what the mystics call the divine ground of being. And it is from this place that we can experience the pure bliss of being alive and knowing without doubt that we are an expression birthed from and made out of the divine intelligence that created all things out of itself. And it is here that we are assured that the choices we make are empowered. Thank you. Namaste. Thank you.